Everyone thinks economic miracles are born from resources, from gold, from factories, from foreign aid. We like to believe that prosperity is something you own, something you can store in vaults, dig out of the ground, or print into existence. But history tells a far more uncomfortable story. Because some of the greatest economic recoveries ever recorded didn't begin with abundance. They began with nothing. No capital, no functioning currency, no trust. And nowhere is this clearer than Germany after World War II. In 1945, Germany was not a nation rebuilding. It was a society barely surviving. Its cities were flattened. Its infrastructure shattered. Its population traumatized. Factories stood silent. Railways were twisted metal. Entire neighborhoods were piles of ash and brick. But the real collapse wasn't physical. It was monetary. The Reichsmark, once a functioning currency, had become meaningless paper. People refused to accept it. Wages were paid but nobody cared. Savings existed on paper but couldn't buy bread. Money was dead. So people did what humans always do when systems fail. They adapted. Germany became a barter economy. Cigarettes replaced banknotes. Soap, coffee, food, and fuel became currency. American cigarettes, not gold, became the unit of account. A doctor was paid in butter. A mechanic was paid in bread. A farmer was paid in shoes. Official money still existed. But it no longer mattered. And that's the first uncomfortable truth we need to face. A currency doesn't die when it inflates. It dies when people stop believing it works. By the late 1940s, Germany wasn't suffering from a lack of money. It was suffering from a lack of confidence. Markets didn't function because nobody trusted tomorrow to look like today. Why sell goods for money that might be worthless by morning? Why produce more than you could personally consume? So production stalled. Trade froze. The economy didn't collapse violently, it paralyzed. And then, in 1948, something happened that should not have worked. No gold reserves were discovered. No miracle shipment of resources arrived. No foreign power handed Germany prosperity. Instead, the authorities did something radical. Something dangerous. Something that, on paper, looked insane. They destroyed the old money. Overnight. Every Reichsmark in circulation was declared obsolete. Savings were wiped out. Balances vanished. Promises dissolved. In its place, they introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark. No gold backing. No silver. No commodity anchor. Just paper. And an idea. At the time, many believed this would finish Germany off for good. But instead it did the opposite. And to understand why, we have to confront the most misunderstood force in economics. Not capital. Not labor. Not technology. But belief. Because what happened next wasn't a financial event. It was a psychological one. Within days of the reform, something strange occurred. Shops that had been empty for years suddenly filled with goods. Farmers brought produce to market. Factories restarted production. Not because Germany suddenly became richer, but because people began acting as if the future was possible again. The money worked, because people decided to use it. And that decision changed everything. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for modern audiences. Because it forces us to ask a question we'd rather avoid. If money only works because we believe in it, what happens when that belief cracks? And if Germany rebuilt itself not on resources but on trust? What does that say about the systems we rely on today? That's where this story is really going. Because the so-called German economic miracle wasn't a miracle at all. It was a demonstration. A demonstration that money is not a thing. It's a relationship. And in the next part, we're going to explore why wiping out savings, something that sounds like economic suicide, actually unlocked one of the most powerful recoveries in modern history. And why the same force that saved Germany is the same force quietly holding today's global economy together. Until it doesn't. Let's be very clear about what happened next. Because history often softens this part, sanitizes it, turns it into a footnote. In 1948, Germany didn't just reform its currency. It erased wealth. Decades of savings, gone. Life insurance policies, gutted. Retirement plans, reduced to fractions of their former value. For millions of people, everything they believed they had worked for simply vanished. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that your bank balance still exists, but buys almost nothing. Not because of hyperinflation this time. Not because prices exploded. But because the system itself decided to reset. 100 Reichsmarks became 10 Deutsche Marks. And even those 10 were only partially usable. For many families it felt like theft. For others, betrayal. People had done everything right. They saved. They trusted institutions. They postponed consumption for the future. And the future never arrived. So why didn't this destroy Germany completely? Why didn't society collapse into chaos, violence, or permanent stagnation? Because something subtle and deeply counterintuitive happened at the same time. The reform didn't just destroy old money. It destroyed old paralysis. Before 1948, people hoarded goods instead of producing them. Why sell today if tomorrow might be worse? Why invest effort if reward was meaningless? But once the reset happened, the waiting game ended. There was no point hoarding Reichsmarks anymore. They were dead. And that death did something extraordinary. It forced people back into the present. Suddenly, producing goods made sense again. Selling made sense. Working made sense. Because the future, however uncertain, was no longer poisoned by the past. This is the second uncomfortable truth. Economic collapse doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from fear of loss. And when that fear is removed, even brutally, systems can move again. The Deutsche Mark wasn't trusted because it was backed by gold. It was trusted because it came with a message. The old game is over. This is the new starting point. That psychological reset mattered more than any reserve asset ever could. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. The currency reform alone would have failed. Completely. Because money without rules is just paper. At the exact same moment the new currency was introduced, Germany did something else. Quietly, almost invisibly, that changed the trajectory of its entire economy. They dismantled price controls. For years, prices had been frozen by the state. Official prices meant nothing. Real prices existed only on the black market. By removing controls, the government allowed prices to become honest again. Painful, yes, but real. And real prices send signals. They tell producers what to make. They tell consumers what to conserve. They coordinate millions of decisions without a central plan. Suddenly, shelves filled up, not because goods magically appeared but because it became rational to sell them. This was not generosity. It was alignment. Money, prices, and incentives finally pointed in the same direction. And for the first time since the war, Germany had something more valuable than capital. It had coherence. This is where the myth of the economic miracle begins to fall apart. Because nothing miraculous happened. No cheat code was discovered. No hidden treasure unlocked. What changed was behavior. People began acting as if effort mattered again. As if tomorrow could be planned. As if contracts meant something. And that behavior created growth. Not the other way around. This is the part that makes modern audiences uncomfortable. Because it suggests that economic recovery doesn't start with money. It starts with belief that effort will not be wasted. And that belief is fragile. In the next part, we'll talk about the system that emerged from this reset, the social market economy, and why it was neither pure capitalism nor pure state control. And more importantly, why it worked then, and why it is far harder to recreate today. After the currency reform, Germany stood at a crossroads. Not an economic one. A philosophical one. The old systems had failed. Central planning had failed. Uncontrolled speculation had failed. Blind faith in institutions had failed. So the question wasn't how to grow faster. The question was far more dangerous. What kind of economy do you build when people no longer trust power? The answer Germany arrived at was neither capitalism as America understood it, nor socialism as the East demanded it. It was something deliberately uncomfortable. A system built on freedom, but constrained by responsibility. They called it the social market economy. And this is where most explanations get it wrong. Because this wasn't a clever economic formula. It was a psychological compromise. Markets were allowed to function. Prices could move. Competition was encouraged. But the state didn't disappear. Instead, it drew lines. Monopolies were restrained. Labor was protected. Social safety nets were built, not to replace markets but to stabilize trust in them. The message was subtle but powerful. You are free to succeed. But you are not free to destroy the system that allows success. This balance mattered more than any regulation or subsidy. Because after the war, Germans didn't need ideology. They needed predictability. Workers needed to believe effort would be rewarded. Businesses needed to believe investment wouldn't be punished. Citizens needed to believe the system wasn't rigged against them. And slowly, almost invisibly, that belief took hold. People didn't work harder because wages were higher. They worked because the rules stopped changing overnight. They didn't save because interest rates were attractive. They saved because saving finally made sense again. This is the third uncomfortable truth. Economic growth follows trust. Not the other way around. Factories didn't restart because money existed. Money became valuable because factories restarted. Production created confidence. Confidence reinforced production. A feedback loop was born. And once that loop stabilizes, growth begins to look like magic. But here's what almost nobody tells you. This system had a cost. A hidden one. To make trust durable, Germany became obsessed with stability. Inflation wasn't just an economic threat. It was a moral one. Because inflation breaks promises quietly. It rewards debtors, punishes savers, and erodes faith without headlines. For a society that had watched money collapse twice in one generation, that was unacceptable. So discipline became cultural. Balanced budgets weren't just policy, they were identity. Low inflation wasn't just a goal, it was a trauma response. And this discipline worked. For decades, Germany rebuilt faster than anyone expected. Exports surged. Industry returned. Living standards rose. From ruins, a powerhouse emerged. And the world drew the wrong conclusion. They saw factories. They saw trade surpluses. They saw productivity. But they missed the real engine. The engine wasn't efficiency. It was shared belief. Belief that rules would hold. Belief that effort mattered. Belief that tomorrow wouldn't erase today. That belief turned paper into money. Work into wealth. Chaos into order. But here's where the story turns darker. Because systems built on trust don't collapse loudly. They decay quietly. And in the next part, we're going to talk about the fragility of this model. Why it demands constant growth. Why it requires discipline that few societies can maintain. And why the very obsession with stability that saved Germany contains the seeds of future tension. Because trust, once broken, is harder to rebuild than any city. The German model worked. That much is undeniable. From the outside it looked almost flawless. Orderly finances, strong industry, a currency people trusted. But what made it powerful also made it fragile. Because trust is not a resource you extract. It's a behavior you maintain. And maintaining it comes at a cost. The social market economy demanded something most systems quietly avoid asking for. Discipline. Not occasionally. Not during crises. But permanently. Low inflation wasn't just preferred, it was sacred. Debt wasn't just risky, it was suspect. Instability wasn't creative, it was dangerous. This mindset shaped everything. Wages grew carefully. Budgets were balanced obsessively. Monetary policy became conservative to the point of rigidity. And for a long time this restraint paid off. Germany became the anchor of Europe. The model student. The proof that restraint could coexist with prosperity. But underneath the success, a tension was building. Because a system based on trust assumes something quietly but relentlessly. That tomorrow will be slightly better than today. Not dramatically better. Not explosively richer. Just better enough. That expectation fuels patience. It justifies saving. It makes restraint tolerable. But what happens when growth slows? What happens when demographics turn? When productivity plateaus? When global competition intensifies? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Trust systems don't fail when people are poor. They fail when people stop believing restraint will be rewarded. And slowly that belief began to fray. Younger generations worked just as hard, sometimes harder, but saw fewer gains. Housing became less affordable. Job security weakened. Globalization eroded the sense of control. The rules hadn't changed, but the outcomes had. And that creates a dangerous psychological gap. Because discipline only feels virtuous when it leads somewhere. When it doesn't, it starts to feel like punishment. This is the paradox at the heart of the German miracle. The same culture that rejected inflation and debt also limited flexibility when the world changed. And the world did change. Growth became harder to sustain. Exports faced competition. The population aged. The model didn't collapse. But it tightened. And when systems tighten too much, they transmit stress. That stress doesn't explode. It accumulates. And this is where the lesson becomes universal. Because Germany's story isn't just about Germany. It's about any economy built on belief. Belief that rules are fair. Belief that effort compounds. Belief that patience pays. Once that belief weakens, money alone can't restore it. You can inject liquidity, lower rates, raise spending. But if people no longer trust the trajectory, those tools lose power. That's the fourth uncomfortable truth. Money can stabilize systems. But only trust makes them move forward. And trust is far harder to engineer than policy. In the next part, we're going to step back and widen the lens. Because what Germany revealed, almost accidentally, is something most modern economies prefer not to admit. that money is not the foundation of the system. It's the reflection of it. And once you understand that, you start seeing today's financial world very differently. By the time Germany's recovery was in full motion, most observers were looking in the wrong place. They studied output, productivity, exports, industrial policy. They measured steel, cars, machines. But they missed what actually held the system together. Because money was never the foundation. It was the surface. The real foundation was something far less tangible and far more fragile. A shared agreement. An unspoken contract. That contract didn't say, "This currency is backed by gold." It said something much more powerful. If you work today, tomorrow will not erase you. That single assumption changed behavior at every level of society. Workers showed up because effort mattered. Businesses invested because rules held. Families saved because the future felt reachable. And the currency reflected that confidence. This is the fifth uncomfortable truth. Money does not create trust. Trust creates money. We prefer the opposite explanation because it feels safer. It allows us to believe that if we just manage interest rates correctly, if we just print carefully, if we just regulate smartly, everything will hold. But Germany's experience exposes a deeper reality. When trust collapses, no amount of money fixes it. When trust exists, surprisingly little money is needed. After 1948, Germany didn't become rich overnight. But it became coherent. And coherence is what turns effort into growth. Now step back for a moment. Look at the modern world. Currencies float freely. Money is digital. Balances exist as numbers on screens. Most people have never seen physical cash in meaningful amounts. They interact with abstractions. And yet everything still works. Why? Because most people still believe the system will be there tomorrow. That belief is doing more work than any central bank. This is where the lesson becomes dangerous. Because social contracts don't break when people argue about them. They break when people stop acting as if they exist. When workers stop believing effort compounds. When savers stop believing patience is rewarded. When citizens stop believing institutions are neutral. The contract doesn't tear loudly. It thins. Quietly. Gradually. Until one day something small goes wrong. And the system doesn't absorb it. Germany's miracle shows us something profound. Economic systems are not machines. They are coordination problems. Millions of people aligning expectations about the future. Money is simply the language they use to coordinate. Change the language, or poison it, and coordination breaks. That's why hyperinflation is so destructive. Not because prices rise, but because trust collapses faster than math. And that's why deflation and stagnation are just as dangerous. Because they tell people effort no longer leads forward. Germany escaped that trap once. But the escape required conditions that are rare. Shared sacrifice, clear rules, credible institutions, and a population willing to accept short-term pain for long-term coherence. Which brings us to the question nobody likes to ask. What happens when a society wants stability, but no longer believes restraint will be rewarded? What happens when the contract still exists on paper, but behavior starts to drift? That's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because the German lesson is not just historical. It's diagnostic. And in the next part, we'll talk about what happens when trust systems stop expanding, and why economies that rely on belief can stagnate long before they collapse. Because collapse is rarely the first symptom. The first symptom is drift. The most dangerous phase in any economic system is not collapse. It's continuation. The moment when everything still works, but for reasons nobody can clearly explain anymore. Germany entered that phase quietly. The rules still existed. The institutions still functioned. The currency still held value. On the surface, nothing was broken. But underneath, the engine had changed. The post-war miracle was driven by rebuilding, by catching up, by converting effort into visible progress. Every factory rebuilt was proof the system worked. Every export shipped reinforced belief. Every improvement in living standards justified discipline. But once rebuilding ended, the logic shifted. Growth slowed, not because of failure, but because the easy gains were gone. And when growth slows in a trust-based system, something subtle happens. People don't rebel. They don't panic. They adjust expectations. They stop believing the future will be better, and start hoping it won't be worse. That shift matters more than any recession. Because hope fuels patience. But fear fuels caution. Savings become defensive. Investment becomes conservative. Innovation becomes riskier than preservation. The system still functions, but it stops moving forward with conviction. This is the sixth uncomfortable truth. Stagnation is not economic failure. It's psychological exhaustion. Germany didn't lose trust overnight. It slowly stopped renewing it. And renewal is the part no model can automate. You can legislate rules. You can set targets. You can stabilize prices. But you cannot force people to believe effort compounds, if experience tells them otherwise. And this is where the lesson expands beyond Germany. Because every modern economy is now built the same way. On belief. Belief that education leads to opportunity. Belief that work leads to security. Belief that saving leads to dignity. Once those links weaken, money becomes symbolic. Still useful. Still circulating. But less convincing. And here's the danger most policymakers misunderstand. When belief weakens, people don't abandon the system immediately. They exploit it. They extract instead of invest. They speculate instead of build. They optimize for survival, not progress. The contract doesn't break. It hollows out. Germany resisted this longer than most. Because its trauma ran deep. Because inflation had burned itself into memory. But even discipline has limits. And when restraint stops delivering visible rewards, pressure builds. Not for reform, but for shortcuts. This is where money systems face their real test. Do they adapt by rebuilding trust? Or do they substitute belief with mechanics? In the next part, we're going to look at how modern economies chose the second option. How trust was gradually replaced by policy tools. How belief was outsourced to institutions. And why that solution works, until it doesn't. Because once trust is replaced by management, money becomes louder, and belief becomes thinner. And history has seen that movie before. When belief weakens, systems don't stop. They compensate. They add layers. Rules on top of rules. Policies on top of policies. Interventions designed to replace what no longer comes naturally. This is where modern economies diverged from the lesson Germany accidentally taught the world. Instead of asking, how do we renew trust? They asked a safer question. How do we manage without it? And for a while that worked. Central banks became more powerful. Models became more sophisticated. Data became more granular. If growth slowed, stimulate. If markets wobbled, intervene. If confidence dipped, reassure. The system didn't rely on belief anymore. It relied on credibility of control. As long as people believed institutions could smooth outcomes, the deeper contract didn't need to be examined. But this shift changed the nature of money. Money stopped being a reflection of shared effort and became a tool of stabilization. That sounds harmless, responsible even, until you realize what gets lost. When trust is organic, people take responsibility for outcomes. When trust is outsourced, responsibility shifts upward. Risk feels distant. Consequences feel abstract. Discipline feels optional. And this is the seventh uncomfortable truth. Managed systems encourage compliance, but erode ownership. People stop asking, is this sustainable? And start asking, will someone step in? This is not a moral failure. It's a rational response. If intervention is guaranteed, why sacrifice today? If mistakes are absorbed by the system, why restrain yourself? Germany's post-war discipline worked precisely because intervention was limited. Rules existed, but outcomes still mattered. Effort still had consequences. Mistakes still hurt. That pain wasn't cruelty. It was information. And information is what keeps trust aligned with reality. When modern systems dulled that feedback, belief didn't disappear. It transformed. People stopped believing in the future they were building and started believing in the institutions managing it. That belief is thinner, more fragile, because institutions don't age well. They overpromise. They adapt slowly. They carry political weight. And when they fail publicly. This is where the German lesson becomes urgent again. Because Germany's miracle worked. Not because the state guaranteed outcomes, but because it guaranteed rules. Predictable, limited, credible. Once outcomes became the target, the system began drifting. And today nearly every advanced economy sits in that same drift. Money still flows. Markets still function. Balances still grow. But belief has shifted from participation to expectation. Expectation that someone else will fix it. That expectation is the most expensive asset any system can carry. Because when it breaks fast. In the next part, we'll talk about why trust-based systems don't collapse first. They overstretch. And how overstretching belief creates pressure that no amount of management can absorb. Because once confidence becomes conditional, money becomes louder, and meaning becomes thin. There is a phase every trust-based system enters, before it breaks. A phase where belief doesn't disappear. It overextends. People still believe the system works, but they believe it works no matter what. And that's where danger lives. Because belief without limit stops being trust and starts becoming assumption. Germany avoided this for a long time, longer than most. But even there, the tension eventually surfaced. The rules were still respected. The institutions still credible. The currency still stable. Yet behavior began to change. Not dramatically. Not rebelliously. Quietly. People still worked but took fewer risks. Still saved, but expected guarantees. Still followed rules but questioned the payoff. And slowly belief shifted from, "This system works because we uphold it," to, "This system will work regardless of what we do." That shift is subtle, but it's fatal. Because systems built on belief require participation. Once belief becomes passive, the system starts carrying weight it was never designed to bear. This is the eighth uncomfortable truth. Trust is not static. It must be earned continuously, or it turns into entitlement. And entitlement is heavy. When people believe stability is guaranteed, they demand more from the system. More protection. More insurance. More smoothing of outcomes. But protection without renewal drains resilience. The system doesn't snap. It stretches. And stretched systems behave strangely. They look stable right up until they aren't. They absorb shocks, until they suddenly can't. They promise continuity, until reality intrudes. This is where money plays its most deceptive role. Because money can mask overstretch. Debt can fill gaps. Liquidity can postpone reckoning. Policy can delay adjustment. But none of those rebuild trust. They borrow it. From the future. Germany's obsession with stability was born from trauma. But over time, that obsession created rigidity. And rigidity in a changing world feels like safety, until it feels like suffocation. This is why trust systems rarely collapse during crises. They collapse after them. When emergency measures become normal. When exceptions become permanent. When belief is replaced by habit. At that point, money still circulates, but meaning thins. People comply but disengage. They participate but hedge. They believe but with conditions. And conditional belief is unstable. Because the moment conditions aren't met, belief doesn't fade. It flips. In the next part, we'll confront the most uncomfortable implication of Germany's story. That the same force which creates economic miracles also creates systemic fragility. And that trust, once it becomes invisible, is often already in danger. Because by the time people start asking, "Do I still believe?" the system has already begun to change. Most people imagine economic collapse as a sudden event. A crash. A panic. A headline. But systems built on trust don't fail that way. They reach a moment of truth. A moment when the gap between belief and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Germany faced that moment once and passed through it. Not because it was richer. Not because it was stronger. But because its social contract was still visible. People understood what was being asked of them. And why. That clarity mattered. Now look at the world in January 2026. Currencies still function. Markets still open. Institutions still speak with confidence. But the contract is harder to read. People work harder, yet feel less secure. They save more, yet trust less. They follow rules, yet question outcomes. This is not collapse. It's dissonance. And dissonance is the warning sign most people miss. Because the system hasn't stopped delivering results. It has stopped delivering meaning. This is the ninth uncomfortable truth. Economies don't fail when numbers break. They fail when stories do. The story that carried Germany forward after 1948 was simple. Effort leads somewhere. Rules apply to everyone. Tomorrow is worth preparing for. When that story holds, people endure hardship. They accept restraint. They cooperate. When it fractures, behavior changes, even if statistics don't. People hedge instead of commit. They extract instead of build. They look for exits instead of futures. And here's what makes this moment dangerous. Unlike 1948, there is no clean reset available. No obvious old money to destroy. No single reform that wipes the slate clean. No shared trauma that forces unity. Modern systems are too complex for dramatic clarity. Which means the adjustment, if it comes, will be slower, messier, psychological before it is financial. That doesn't mean catastrophe is guaranteed. But it does mean something is being tested. Whether belief can be renewed, without being reset. Whether trust can be rebuilt, without collapse. Germany's miracle teaches us this. Belief can resurrect systems from ruins, but it cannot be taken for granted. And here's the uncomfortable implication. If money is a social contract, then inflation, debt, and intervention are not just economic tools. They are messages. Messages about who bears cost, who carries risk, who the system protects. And people listen to those messages more closely than policymakers realize. By the time confidence breaks, it's not because people didn't understand the system. It's because they understood it too well. In the final part, we're going to bring this story home. We'll answer the question this entire series has been circling. If money is built on trust, what happens next? Who adapts? Who resists? And who inherits the future? Because every system built on belief eventually asks the same question of its participants. Do you still choose to uphold it? If you strip this story down to its core, past the dates, past the policies, past the economics, you're left with something uncomfortably simple. Money is not what holds a society together. Expectation does. The expectation that effort is not wasted, that rules are real, that tomorrow is connected to today. Germany after the war had almost nothing, but it rebuilt that expectation from zero. Not with gold, not with foreign miracles, but with a shared decision to behave, as if the future mattered again. That decision turned paper into money, work into growth, chaos into order. And that's the part most people miss. The German economic miracle wasn't created by the Deutsche Mark. The Deutsche Mark was created by the miracle of renewed belief. And belief is not passive. It's not optimism. It's not hope. It's behavior. People showed up. They produced. They traded. They restrained themselves. Because they believed restraint had meaning. That belief became culture. That culture became stability. That stability became prosperity. But here is the final uncomfortable truth. Belief is not permanent. It cannot be stored. It cannot be printed. It cannot be managed indefinitely from above. It must be renewed by outcomes that feel fair, rules that feel real, and futures that feel reachable. When those weaken, money still circulates, but trust quietly leaks out. And when trust leaks out, systems don't collapse immediately. They drift, they harden, they overmanage, until one day people stop asking, how do I participate? And start asking, how do I protect myself? That is the moment history starts moving again. Not with headlines, not with sirens, but with a shift in behavior. Germany's story matters, because it reminds us of something modern finance prefers to forget. Money is not wealth. Coordination is wealth. Trust is wealth. Shared belief is wealth. And when those disappear, no amount of currency can replace them. As we move deeper into the second half of the 2020s, this question is no longer academic. It's practical. Do people still believe effort compounds? Do they still believe rules apply evenly? Do they still believe tomorrow is worth building? Because the answers to those questions will shape the next economic era, far more than any policy announcement ever could. History doesn't repeat itself mechanically, but it does repeat psychologically. And every generation eventually faces the same choice: to understand the system they live in, or to trust it blindly until it no longer works. If this kind of deep financial history matters to you, if you want to understand not just what happens in markets, but why societies believe in them at all, then this is exactly what we do here. This channel exists to document the hidden architecture of finance, the forgotten lessons, the moments where belief built or destroyed entire systems. If you want to keep exploring those stories, subscribe to Finance Archives. Because the future doesn't belong to those who react the fastest. It belongs to those who understand what everyone else takes for granted. And history has a lot more to teach, if you know where to look.